So I think it would be kind of interesting to give you a walkthrough about some of the things you may need to learn if you want to become a web developer. I'm just going to go ahead and wing this and just try to add on topic after topic and build upon some of the things that I've learned along the way and some of the things that you probably are going to learn as well. So when it comes to web development, you have the front end, you have the back end, and you have a process for deploying everything out to your infrastructure. So obviously the first thing that you can do if you're a beginner is focus on the front end. And when it comes to front-end engineering, some of the things that you're more than likely going to learn about are going to include HTML. I'll just go ahead and put HTML there. You are going to be learning about styling, so CSS. And then, of course, you're going to learn about JavaScript. So let's just go ahead and make another one. I'll say JavaScript. And these are the bare minimum that you need to be successful building out a UI. The HTML is the structure of the page. The CSS is the styling of that page. And the JavaScript adds some interactivity. And you could build a couple of static sites and get them hosted on GitHub pages or something like that as your first iteration of learning how to get into web development. You'll probably build components and build forms and stuff like that. So we can kind of go down this path of what are some of the things that you need to start learning when you're learning about HTML. First one that probably the most important are forms. That's probably the bread and butter of all pages, right? You have to have a form so people can fill in information. You're going to have inputs. Those are going to have submit buttons. So we can just go ahead and say like an input here. We can say like a text area. We could go ahead and say like a button for submitting. There's sliders, there's other components. And as you get more advanced with what you're building, you could have like a multi-step wizard. So I could just go ahead and say like multi-step wizard, multi-step wizards. And the more you build out, you're going to get exposed to the various things like, you know, there's like a video element. Let's say you're building it like a course platform. You're probably going to want to display videos. Let's say that you want to display out images, you know, all the typical HTML tags. You probably need to understand it and how nesting these HTML things can be used to build up a page. Now, somewhere along the way, you're probably going to make this website. You need to make it look nice, right? So this is where you're going to get into CSS. And you're probably going to learn a lot about like Flexbox. You could do like padding, margins. Now, like I said, there's no plan to this video. I'm just going to kind of list out stuff. But at some point, you kind of get the gist, right? CSS, you end up learning about all these attributes, how to create a page, how to style it, how to change the coloring of the background, of the foreground, how to add transitions. So like if you want to have like some really cool animations, you're probably going to have to learn about CSS transitions, maybe even animations. There's a way to make like keyframes. So transition/animations. Now, honestly, that's more for like marketing sites. I haven't really seen too much of that on an actual application. And then, of course, eventually you will get to the JavaScript side of things where if you want to make an interactive web page, you're going to have to learn about JavaScript. So you're going to go and probably learn about how to do DOM elements. So like, you know, DOM manipulation. Maybe I should color these to make it look cool. I'm going to go ahead and just like add some colors to all these. By the way, I'm trying to get into the habit of making videos again. I kind of took a break. I got kind of burned out. But I do want to keep on making videos. So let's just go ahead and keep pushing through this video and kind of force myself to make something. So JavaScript, as you're a beginner, you're going to learn about DOM manipulation. You're going to learn about events. So like on click listeners, you know, scroll listeners, stuff like that. And then eventually you're going to get into something called like Ajax. So you want to be able to do a fetch request to a backend. I'll say fetch Ajax. So you can get some data and dynamically update your page. So like dynamic interactions. Now, as you're kind of building out your front end, now you're getting a little bit more advanced, right? You have like these forms and these pages that can dynamically add and remove data. Like maybe you want a button that says delete and you click it. It makes a request to a backend to delete some data. So eventually you're going to get to the point where you're like, okay, I feel like I'm pretty good at front end now. I can build out like a decent application. But now you probably want to move on to the backend a little bit, right? You want to actually have like an API, something that you can actually do these fetch and Ajax requests to. So we're going to go ahead and just move on a little bit to the back end side of things. Now, if you're a beginner, I would probably say just learn Node.js is probably a good starting point, since it'll lock you into the same syntax of the JavaScript that you're learning in the front end. Okay, so we will move on to the back end. I will say there's a ton of stuff in the front end that I didn't even talk about. Like we didn't even touch on React or Angular or Vue or all these frameworks and these meta frameworks that build upon it. But I'm going to try to do this as an iterative talk. Like if I was a beginner, what are some of the things I would probably recommend that you learn first and you build upon it? That's some of the best ways to learn is to try to like start with the foundation of your knowledge and then you stack these blocks on top, because every block that you stack on top really depends on knowing the thing that you're building upon with these layers of abstraction. Okay, so eventually you have like a form that's going to submit some data somewhere, and you have to store that into a backend. So the backend, you're probably going to go and learn a little bit about, I don't know, Node.js or something. So I'll just go ahead and say like Node.js. Go ahead and make it green because, why not? And then maybe you'll learn a little bit about Express. So I'll just go ahead and say like, we'll say like Express.js. Again, you can swap this out with whatever you want. Maybe you're using Django or Fast API. Maybe you want to use Go for this. It doesn't really matter. The ideas are still the same because you're going to be making out a REST API. So I'm going to go ahead and just get into territory of like RESTful APIs and how that all kind of works. And as you're learning about REST APIs, you're probably going to learn about the traditional CRUD operations. So CRUD, I'll say get, post, put, patch, delete. These are your HTTP methods that you can use to kind of implement these CRUD operations. And again, Express is the library that can help you get that way. Now, at some point, you might be using Express and you want to get something a little bit more advanced. So maybe you'll get to maybe you'll try pulling in like Nest.js. It has like a better, more structured paradigm of building out a REST API and has like built-in Swagger documentation and stuff like that. And then, of course, you'll probably dive into learning a little bit different things. Like maybe you want to learn a little bit about Bun. Maybe it's easier to write some code with Bun. Maybe you'll even try Dino. I don't know why, but maybe you will. And again, the point is when you're trying to learn web development, you're trying to build this network of knowledge and you're kind of always adding on this new thing just to understand why does this thing exist? Why do we have Dino? Why do we have Bun? What were the problems that Bun and Dino were trying to solve? For example, Bun was trying to make it super simple to run either JavaScript or TypeScript. We have all these different types of approaches like ESM modules. We have, you could do imports, you could do require.js. In fact, let me just go ahead and put that. I'll say module system. This is important to learn because if you're just doing static sites on the front end, you probably haven't even understood how to do module systems, okay? So that can involve ESM, that could be require.js, common.js. I don't know why I wrote require.js, common.js. Okay, so now you're building upon this. You have a backend API. All right, so now you're building up your knowledge. You have this REST API. You're able to connect to it. Maybe you'll get into something like templating. Typically, if you're using Express or Rails or Django, you'll have a templating engine that you may or you may not want to use. And that templating engine can be used to serve your static pages and inject data when it's first requested. So again, all this stuff is not going to work unless you have something like a database. So eventually you're going to get into the territory of learning about databases. I'll just say databases. I know the text is a little bit small. Let me make the text a little bit larger for all these. I'll do large so we can actually see this text. I'm just going to keep on adding circles. I think we might have 100 circles by the end of this. Okay, so you'll do databases and you'll probably grab something like, SQL. Okay. Typically, Postgres is what a lot of tutorials are doing today. Maybe you've watched a MERN stack tutorial from 5 years ago. Maybe you're learning about Mongo. Okay, the idea is that you want to learn about all these different databases. What problems did they solve? Why would you use a SQL database versus a NoSQL database? So I'll just go ahead and say NoSQL. And maybe you'll learn a little bit about writing insert statements, writing queries and stuff like that. Maybe you'll start bringing in some tooling such as pgadmin or dbeaver so you can actually connect to your SQL database to understand how to look at your tables and your data. And you're you know what, this is a lot of work writing a bunch of SQL statements. Maybe you actually start bringing in something such as an ORM. So on your backend, you're going to bring in an ORM, which, there's a lot of different ones out there. You can use Prisma. That's a big one that people use. You could also use Drizzle. You could use Keasley. There's a lot of ORMs, right? And you'll find out the reason why we use ORMs is that writing all these SQL statements by hand and keeping them up to date and make sure they're secure, it's just a lot of extra work. And ORMs typically have a lot of stuff built into them, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so you're building out your database and you realize, okay, I just added new tables and I need a way to replicate this on a higher environment. So now you're learning more about writing something called migration scripts. So I'll say migrations, and that is typically how do you create and update and change and alter your tables in a nice, consistent way. So you kind of promote your changes across your environments. Okay, so now I'm mentioning things that are kind of getting into DevOps. So I'm going to go ahead and just add another thing over here. To get your front end and your back end all deployed out, you're probably going to start learning something called DevOps. So you need a way to basically host this stuff, right? So you have to have a VPS somewhere. So maybe you want to get into the realm of a VPS host. You could go ahead and grab a VPS. But then you need to actually get your service installed in there. So you might SSH into the machine. You then do a git pull on your repo. Uh-oh, we just mentioned the new term. We talked about version control. So version control, you're probably gonna learn something like Git. There's other things out there like Subversion. I don't know what, I've always used Git for the longest time. So that's like the de facto standard, I think, in this industry at this point. But you'll learn about version control. And then with DevOps, you'll find a way to basically like, how do I make it so when a developer makes changes to my code, how do I get that code to automatically deploy out to my VPS? So that's going to lead you down a path of maybe learning a little bit about like CI, CD. Okay, so you have like a pipeline that's listening to your Git repo. Maybe you want to use something like a GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions. There's also something called like Circle CI you can use. There's Travis CI. There's a lot of different CI CD build tools out there that you can use, where you're going to have to learn how to like design workflows. Basically, these are just a bunch of like workflow YAML files. And they all have their own special syntax of how you can get this kind of, you know, grabbing your code, building your code, and then testing your code. Okay, let's talk about another one that's very important. So you're going to start learning about testing. You want to learn about how to test the code that you're writing so that if you have multiple developers trying to change code over time, you want to write automated tests. So there's a lot of different ways you can do testing. There's unit tests. This is like the fastest way you can write tests. It's they don't really give you that much value, in my opinion, unless it's a very, very pure function that you can just test the inputs and the outputs that come back. But eventually, you're probably going to try to write some integration tests. So just go ahead and say like integration tests. Let's do integration. And then, of course, there's another one called end-to-end. And there's system tests. And there's load tests. And there's performance tests. I'm going to say end-to-end. We could do like Cypress or Playwright, something like that. There's a lot of tools out there for testing. Let me just change this color so I can kind of keep you guys engaged. Let's go ahead and change this to like a blue. Why not? All right, so right now, you started off as a beginner, you made a little web page, you know, you got your little HTML stuff deployed to like GitHub pages or like Netlify pages or something. And then you add some functionality and you realize you needed backend. You start adding a database and your Express service and all this other stuff. And then you find out that you need to actually get all this stuff deployed out. You start diving into DevOps, you spin up a VPS. Maybe you actually want to get into more advanced territory and start getting into like AWS. So here's another cool thing you'll start learning. Let's say AWS. In fact, instead of saying AWS, let's say cloud services. So there's a bunch of different cloud services out there. One of the big ones that you've probably heard is AWS. Okay, this is where you can go and spin up VPSs if you want. You can go and you can spin up a bunch of other things. They have like complete managed solutions that can kind of take your Docker images. Okay, that's another thing we could probably talk about. Like eventually you may want to containerize your stuff. So I'm gonna go ahead and just draw another line here. We'll say Docker. Okay, maybe you want to get into the realm of Docker and how do you actually like build Docker containers that can containerize your code so you can deploy them to something like, I don't know, we could say Fargate. We'll just draw a little line here. We could say like Fargate. Again, AWS has a bunch of managed services. I think Fargate is one of the main ones for ECS, where you can like, deploy. Maybe you need ECR for where you can store this built up container. But anyway, so like when someone pushes some code to your Git repo, you can kick off a CI/CD pipeline that builds a Docker container and then publishes that to ECR, so you can then later use it when you're deploying. So you might learn about Docker Compose and how to actually like run multiple services, because when you have to host something on, like, for example, a VPS, it's not just one service, right? You typically have like a database, you might have like a Redis service running, you might have like some type of message broker. Okay, there's another one. We should probably talk about a message broker. So I'm just going to put it over here because I don't really know where this belongs. Is it infrastructure? I'm going to say like a message broker. So you might go and start learning a little bit about Redis. Okay, maybe you want to learn something like Kafka. Is that how you spell it? Kafka? I don't know if I spelled it right. But anyway, the message broker will come into the whole like backend realm of things. I don't have enough space to even get this line. Let's just see if I can get a line over here. Oop, let's just do this. Okay, so message brokers, again, like when you start getting into more advanced systems, maybe you're going to get into microservices where now it's not just one backend service, you have multiple backend services, and these things need to communicate with each other using messages via a message broker. So you'll have like a centralized message broker that can kind of act as the place that all these different backend microservices communicate over. And there's Redis, there's Kafka, there's a bunch of like AWS SQS is one as well. But again, as you keep on adding stuff to your backend logic, like it just starts getting a little bit more complicated. So then you start using something called infrastructure as code. So I'm gonna go ahead and just copy this. I'll say infrastructure as code. Usually they just call it IAC, but that's basically the acronym for it. And then you'll get into the realm of like, I don't know, we'll say Terraform is one. You probably heard CDK is one. Cloud Formation. There's Pulumi. There's SST. So there's a bunch of tools out there where basically you write a bunch of code and then you run a command to have all that code basically spin up various services inside whatever cloud services that you want to use. I mean, there's a bunch of different cloud services. There's like Google Cloud Platform, GCP. I think Microsoft Azure is one as well. So we can just go ahead and say Azure. I think Alibaba. But anyway, you write this infrastructure as code so that you can automatically deploy these various things on your cloud services, your cloud providers, I think is a better name for this, your cloud provider. And then eventually you'll probably get to like multi-tiered environments, and that's why you're going to want infrastructure as code, and you want this like way to automate everything. And of course, there's a bunch of stuff I didn't mention here when you're dealing with like DevOps or like systems engineering, like bash scripting, whatever else. I think something else I should do here is like observability. Like, let's just go ahead and draw one more line here, and I'll say observability. Okay, there we go. And there's a bunch of stuff out there that I'm not going to dive into for observability. It really depends on how you have your stuff deployed out. You can use like PostHog, or you can use AWS Cloud Watch, or whatever else. Basically, you want to be able to aggregate all the logs from all your different services so you know when stuff is failing, and you can kind of do stuff, and also like set up alerts so that your developers can kind of tackle the bugs right when they start happening if there's like critical issues. So that's what observability is. It's like knowing when stuff's about to fail before it even fails, like getting system reports of your machines, your CPU usage, your memory usage of everything. But I do realize that I kind of neglected the front end, right? I started really simple and then I kind of got a little bit more advanced. Let's go back to the front end, because eventually you're going to be building out applications that are probably a little bit more advanced. Like, we're eventually going to want to bring in something like a framework or a library. So I'm going to go ahead and just like bring in something like here. We could do like Angular, React, Vue, Svelte, whatever it is. Like, there's going to be frameworks that kind of help you write front ends, because you'll find out that as you start getting more complex front ends and you have these various components on your page that need to interact with each other, you just want to have something like Angular, React, or Vue so that you can have good state management. So that's something you're going to learn about, state management. Like, how do you share state between like your different components? And in React, you might use like a provider, you might use Zustan or Jotai or whatever. I'm just going to just draw like Zustan and Jotai. There's a bunch of ones out there. Redux is one. Okay, so you might start diving into that. You start learning about that. Okay, also in the front end, like, you'll start realizing that, okay, I don't want to spend all this time building out components. Like, there's probably a better way instead of me have to manually create these components. And so you start learning a little bit about a component library system. So you might do like Ant Design. You might be using ShadCN is one. So you want to bring in these like pre-existing components so that you as a developer can quickly just like build something, right? You don't want to have to spend a bunch of time building out a slider component. You want to find one online. You know, eventually you're going to have to learn about NPM. I think I have modules somewhere. What did I do? Like a module system. Okay, so NPM, you're going to have to learn how to basically grab random people's open source modules from the internet and integrate them in your own project. So NPM is where you kind of do that. What are some other things? So eventually you realize that, okay, this is kind of complicated, right? They have a separate backend and then a front end. And it's like, how do I actually simplify this a little bit? And also like getting this thing all like deployed out. Like, you may start reaching for solutions that are just kind of all inclusive. For example, like maybe you're going to do something like Netlify, or maybe you want to use like Vercel, right? It would be nice if there's a way to just basically, here's my app. I want you to deploy it. I don't want to have to write the GitHub actions myself. I just want you to grab my code from GitHub and just like automatically build it and deploy it for me. Okay. So then you're going to be like, okay, let's use a managed service like Vercel. And we have to find a way to like basically combine the front end and the back end together to make this a little bit simpler. Right. So you may start using something like Next.js. So let's just go ahead and build like a Next.js here. You can also say like TanStack start. Basically any of these things that are like all inclusive, Remix, they're called like meta frameworks. I'll say meta framework. And of course, Next.js is the big one. TanStack starts what I've been kind of using a lot in my videos now. And then Remix is one that a lot of people have been using. But it's a way to kind of combine your front end and your back end. You'll start learning about like server actions, which are ways to abstract the way your REST API. So server actions, which are really just RPCs, so remote procedure calls that are built into the framework itself, just to make your life a little bit easier. But of course, this stuff all has trade-offs, right? Using RPC versus having your open REST API, or using like something like GraphQL, which I didn't even mention, but somewhere I have REST over here. But maybe another thing you're going to learn is GraphQL. So we'll just go and say GraphQL. It's just another approach to basically allowing your front end, your clients to fetch data from your backend in your database. You know what? I didn't even talk about authorization, authentication. So like, let's draw a line. This is just getting insane right now. Let's just do this. I'm gonna draw a line over here because we're gonna make this really crazy. I'm gonna say authentication and authorization. So eventually you're gonna start learning about cookies. So we're gonna go over here and we're gonna say, well, cookies is how you can basically have authentication set up so when your users make requests to your backend, you can know if they're authenticated or not. But then in order to have the cookie, you do have to learn about, session management. So like session management, you basically have to create like a session object and store that in your database so that you can track when a user is logged in, and then also how to clear that out. Eventually, you're going to have to get into OAuth. So you want to be able to do like Google login. So OAuth, Google login, GitHub login, single sign-in. There's a bunch of other terms out there you're probably going to end up learning about. And of course, you may end up learning something like JWT, which is another authentication strategy. Typically, it's used for more like stateless. And now that I say stateless, I think we should probably talk about serverless versus serverful. Eventually, in the backend, you're going to learn about stateful versus stateless APIs. Now, if you're using stateful APIs, typically that's just like you get an express service, you deploy that somewhere, it can actually store stuff in memory. It has state that it holds on to, so all your users can access that state on every request. Versus stateless, you might end up learning something like serverless. Okay, so that includes like AWS Lambda. I think Cloudflare Workers is one. Okay, so typically these are like every request spins up its own isolated thing. It runs some computation and then it returns back a result. And you don't expect that to store any state. Okay, but sometimes you do want to store state. And so there's solutions out there, such as like a KV store, which is built into like something like Cloudflare. So a KV store, or like Redis if you want to cache something. So eventually you do end up needing state if you want to like have caching. That's probably another thing I should probably talk about is caching. To kind of increase the performance of your backend, you probably want to add some type of caching system. Or what you end up doing is you bring in like something like a CDN. So we should probably go over here and talk a little bit about a CDN. So that's a way to basically take your assets, whether it's images, your videos, or your responses from your API and cache them so that everyone on the globe can get that data as fast as possible. So now we're kind of diving into performance. How do you make your backend more performant? Which I don't know if I even want to go down that path because I have a lot of bubbles over here. All right, so our knowledge base is getting a little bit bigger now. And these are some of the things that you're probably going to get exposed about. Can we keep on adding upon this, or should we kind of call it quits? Let's move back to the front end real quick because I do think I kind of neglected the front end. So on the front end, you are going to eventually learn something called accessibility. So accessibility, that's basically people out there who are disabled or like can't view your website very well or have like, missing limbs or deformities. Typically, you want to create a site that is accessible for as many people as possible. And that is something that you're going to kind of dive into. There's a bunch of like built-in plugins and Chrome extensions for accessibility. Like Pally is one. There's Axe is another one. And you'll learn about all the best like accessibility best practices like contrast ratios. You'll probably learn about, I'll say contrast. There's like a bunch of ARIA labels that you eventually have to add onto things. You'll learn about semantic HTML because that does help out with accessibility. So semantic HTML. Disregard my colors. They don't really mean anything. I'm kind of just changing up the colors just for fun. Okay, we talked about security in the back end, but there's also security concerns for the front end. So I'm gonna go ahead and say security here. And when it comes to the front end, there's a bunch of things that you need to kind of keep in mind. Like there's cross-site scripting. So XSS, cross-site scripting. There's content security policy. So CSP, basically when you load up a site, you have this thing that the browser reads to know what your application should and should not be able to reach out to. Like you can actually lock down to make sure that your site only ever reaches back to your certain domain. Or if you have like a third-party service like CDN.js, you can allow that. So you're probably learning about content security policies. Another security thing is cross-site request forgery. So if you're using cookies, that's probably something you should look into to make sure that when you submit your forms or people try to do like replay attacks on your site, it doesn't potentially open you up for attacks there. Again, that's scratching the surface. And some of this is also like backend security related as well. So we talked about Next.js, we talked about the meta frameworks, we talked about Angular. So if we zoom out for a second, here are some of the things that you should probably be learning as a web developer. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's a lot of stuff that I didn't include here that I probably know I just forgotten. But there's also a lot of stuff depending on the niche that you work on, you may or may not be exposed to as well. I feel like my front end stuff is kind of light. I'm not sure like what exactly I might be missing here, but I'm sure there's quite a lot of stuff in here that's important to learn. Now, again, this is a lot of the technical stuff, but when it comes to building out software, it's not just all technical, right? You do have like project management type of things, right? You have like agile development. So like if you are working on a team of many people, you're going to have to do pull requests and reviews, so PR reviews. You're going to have design discussions. So you'll have like a meeting where you go and you talk to everybody and you kind of draw out diagrams. So like diagrams, documentation, design discussions. If you're working on an open source project, maybe you'll have an RFP, the request for proposal. Basically, if you want to change something, some major change in an open source project, you basically have a big write-up. People can comment on it, people can chat on it, people can upvote it, downvote it, whatever. And you'll kind of like discuss your ideas with other people and try to see if that's something that could work with the project. Again, Agile is probably something you'll end up doing. I think Agile is still something really big in the industry where you're going to have like daily stand-ups. So like you have to basically meet with your team every day. So daily stand-ups for like 5 or 15 minutes where you talk about what you did yesterday, what you're doing today, any blockers if you need help. Now, personally, where I work, we do a lot of pair programming. So I'm going to go ahead in here and I'll put another thing. I'll say pair programming. I think the original term was extreme programming, where basically you work with another developer throughout your day. You kind of try to solve the problem together. You bounce ideas off each other. You knowledge share. And if you are doing Agile or Scrum, you're probably going to have like demos, right? So you're going to have to demo to your stakeholders, right? They need to see what you're building. You need to show them what you're building so they can give you feedback. So you might have your demos. Also, if you're working on a team that is Agile or Scrum, you might have retrospectives where you basically talk about what went well on this sprint. So typically with this type of approach, every 2 weeks, you kind of chunk up the things you want to get done. And then at the very end of it, you kind of talk with your team about like how well did it go. Some of the stuff I find kind of pointless to do, especially if you're doing asynchronous communication where like you're talking with your team all day in Slack. And if you're doing pair programming, like the retrospectives are kind of silly because like I'm literally talking with my team all day and your client should be in your Discord with you or your Slack with you asking you questions. Okay, I think this is a lot of stuff. My computer laptop is about to die. I'm going to go ahead and just call it a quit here. But if there's anything that I didn't mention in this video, because I'm just out of ideas at this point, I literally just wanted to kind of like brain dump all the keywords that you may or may not run into when you're trying to become a web developer. And I think this could probably expand in all directions even more so. Like some of these are libraries, some of these are tooling, some of these are patterns and accessibility. Like these are just industry best practices. This is like technology. So I'm kind of all over the place in this diagram, but I think if you were able to follow along, depending on where you are in your web development journey, you should be able to mark off some of these things, right? For example, some of this DevOps stuff in the yellow, maybe you haven't gone to that realm yet, but at the very least, I mean, there should be a lot of the stuff on the front end that you should have been exposed to. There should be some stuff on the project management side of things that you should be exposed to. I might as well just make all this stuff blue for the front end. Let's see if I can just make this all blue. And then for the back end, I'll just make that all green. Why not? So I'm just going to go ahead and make these things green, just so we have a better understanding of like the separation of some of this stuff. So I would be curious, like if there's something that I didn't mention in this talk, like what are some keywords that you think are really important for a web developer and that you will probably get exposed to at some point in your career? I'd be curious. Leave a comment below. But yeah, I just hope to kind of give you an overview of some of the things you may be exposed to when you're trying to become a web developer. As you can see, it's quite a lot, and I've been doing this for quite a while. So just every day, just try to learn something new. And you may or may not hit one of these bubbles in your current journey, but eventually you'll probably end up getting exposed to one of these things. Anyway, I hope this video was interesting or at least entertaining to watch. Have a good day and happy coding.